As of the end of 2022, I have ridden 235 different roller coasters across the US. In today's video, I will be showcasing the top 25 coasters that I have ridden. This list will be a bit different from other lists you might have seen because my personal preferences and coasters are different. Unlike a lot of people who prefer airtime over everything else, I usually prefer coasters with intensity and a great sense of speed. I also value powerful launches over non-stop airtime, with smoothness also playing a role here. There are some rides that do focus on airtime that will make this list, but chances are they probably won't be ranked as high. The ranking of each of these coasters are not only based on my personal preferences, but also the sheer fun factor and how well the elements deliver. Before I reveal my top 25, here are the first 5 coasters that didn't make the cut. Number 30 is Racer at Kings Island. Due to one of the coasters that did make the top 25 having 2 sides to it, and only one of them being in my actual top 25, I personally have both sides of Racer ranked at number 31 and 32. I'm combining them as one coaster for the sake of this video. This is why Racer is number 30. When Racer is actually racing, this is easily the most fun coaster at Kings Island for me. I've ridden it when it's not racing, and it's just not the same. The only reason why I don't have Racer ranked higher on my list is because the coasters ahead of it are too strong. If this list was full of coasters ranked purely based on how fun they are, Racer would easily be near the top. Coming in at number 29 is Twisted Cyclone at Six Flags Over Georgia. I hadn't heard too much about this RMC before I went back to Six Flags Over Georgia last year. It looked like a solid ride from the outside, but when I actually rode it, I was very impressed. This RMC had some of the strongest airtime I've experienced. Unfortunately, the ride opposite Twisted Cyclone were stapling like crazy, so this made it ridiculously hard to get any airtime, especially up front. But when I was not stapled, the ride was great. I just can't rank it higher since it's too short of a ride. Number 28 is one of the biggest losers of the year for me, and that is the Legend at Holiday World. While the ride was running incredibly smooth this year thanks to the track work it got, I also felt that the laterals did not feel anywhere nearly as strong as they did in 2020 or 2021. Granted, it was a bit cooler when I visited Hollywood Nights this year, so maybe it wasn't running quite as fast. If I had to guess, I think the temperature was either in the mid to high 70s or low 80s during the event. And in 2021, it had to have been around 90 degrees. Legend was in my top 25 prior to Hollywood Nights this year, but I have to knock it down after the rides I got this year. Coming in at number 27 is the Beast at Kings Island. It may be controversial to rank this coaster ahead of the Legend, but I've thought that the Beast ran better than the Legend this year. Both coasters got some extensive track work, but they both felt less intense. The reason why I have the Beast ranked higher is because outside of the Helix, the rest of the ride felt just as intense as I remembered it in 2020 and 2021. Whereas with the Legend, the whole ride felt less intense. In terms of where I rank it with the coasters at Kings Island, the Beast is my favorite wooden coaster in the park, ahead of Racer, which we already saw, along with Mystic Timbers, which did not make the cut. I know this may upset some people that Mystic Timbers did not make my top 25, but my issue with this ride is that the airtime wasn't there even when holding up the lap bar in the front row and the back row. Because of this, I cannot justify putting it on the list. Back to the Beast. I currently have it as my number 2 overall coaster at Kings Island, and I mentioned intensity and speed earlier. The sense of speed on this ride is solid, especially later in the day. I also find the Helix at the end to be quite intense, even though it was a shell of its former self this year. Still, the ride is a blast from start to finish. The last coaster on my list that just missed my top 25 is Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket at Universal Studios Florida. Going into this ride, I knew it had a bad reputation as being really rough. This had me worried that I wouldn't like it because extreme roughness can really ruin a ride for me. But at the same time, I was super excited to play some songs from the coaster's secret song list, so I didn't know if I would love it or hate it. Turns out, I really enjoyed it. Now, the people that said it was rough are not wrong. Rocket is not a smooth coaster, and normally I have a hard time looking past the roughness of the ride. This is one of the only coasters that I'm able to do that with since the rest of the experience was great. The airtime was excellent, and there were multiple times where I grayed out since the positives were really strong. All that plus the on-ride soundtrack is why it's number 26 for me. If the ride was smoother, it almost for sure would rank higher than it currently does. Now let's kick off the top 25. We are kicking off the top 25 with a legendary coaster. This is Space Mountain at Magic Kingdom. I bet you didn't expect me to kick off the top 25 with it, but Space Mountain is a huge sentimental favorite of mine. This coaster is technically 2 coasters since it has the Alpha track and the Omega track, and is the reason why I mentioned only one side of Racer being in my top 30. If I was to count both tracks as separate entries on this list, I would have the Omega track ranked at number 25 and the Alpha track ranked at number 26. Much like Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket, I hear a lot of people call Space Mountain rough. I've ridden this in 2012, 2017, and most recently in 2018, and I've never found it to be rough at all. It is a bit jerky here and there, but if anything, that adds to the chaotic ride experience. Space Mountain takes place completely in the dark, and this amplifies the sense of speed. The ride's max speed is 27 miles an hour, but it feels like you're going way faster than that. There's also some really good airtime on Space Mountain, and it catches me off guard every single time I ride it. The last time I was at Disney World, I marathoned Space Mountain 25 times across both tracks over the 3 days I was there. That was for a few reasons. For one, I had just gotten on all the other major coasters at the resort in June of 2017, so I did not get enough rides on Space Mountain. Second, Space Mountain was by far my favorite ride at Walt Disney World, even over the other coasters I got on. No matter how many times I ride Space Mountain, I always have the biggest smile on my face, especially if I'm racing the other train. Every now and then, I'll be almost perfectly in line with another train going up the lift hill on the opposite track, and this brings some added excitement to the ride for me. I sadly have not gotten a legendary Lights On ride yet, but that's on my bucket list. Actually, I have. Sorta. There are a few rides where the people mover had broken down, and so those lights turned on and partially illuminated Space Mountain's interior. But a ride with the building's interior lights turned on, like when the ride breaks down, getting a ride like that is on my bucket list for sure. Space Mountain has always been a wonderful experience, which puts it on the list. The first of many launch coasters takes the number 24 spot. This is Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas. When I went to Texas back in 2019, I visited Six Flags Over Texas, Six Flags Fiesta Texas, SeaWorld San Antonio, and ZDT's amusement park. Out of those 4 parks, I thought that Mr. Freeze was the best coaster out of all of them. I say that because Iron Rattler was sadly closed when I was at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, and while I did enjoy Wonder Woman, New Texas Giant, and Steel Eel, they didn't quite stack up to Mr. Freeze for me. Since I did ride it back in 2019, it was still running as Mr. Freeze Reverse Blast. It recently started launching forwards again, but I haven't experienced it like that yet. But it is possible I could be experiencing like that in 2024. The one at Six Flags St. Louis still launches backwards, and you'll see that one on the list later on. Both Mr. Freeze clones are very intense rides, but Over Texas seems to have more bite to it, especially on that launch. For whatever reason, the launch on Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas felt way more intense than the one in St. Louis. I even did a marathon on it just for the launch. The rest of the ride was also insane, which puts it at number 24. I just discussed my favorite coaster in Texas. Now let's go to California for my favorite coaster in that state, Twisted Colossus. I feel like this RMC has become extremely underrated among coaster enthusiasts as of late. Usually I hear people raving about how great X2 is, and I don't hear Twisted Colossus getting the same praise. I say that because whenever I do hear people talk about Twisted Colossus, it seems like it's getting trashed more often than not. I think that's very unfortunate because I did not like X2 at all, and Twisted Colossus shocked me with how good it was. I could go more in depth about that, but I'll say that for another video in the future. Much like Space Mountain, the last time I rode Twisted Colossus was back in 2018, so it's been over 4 years. However, I remember the experience being great. The airtime was really good on this thing, and I got extremely lucky with the dueling. I got 5 rides on Twisted Colossus, which means I had 10 chances of racing the other train. I almost had a perfect dueling record as I raced 9 out of 10 times. The dueling really sold this ride for me, even though all the elements delivered as well. I felt like Twisted Colossus was missing something from the one time that I did not duel, but the other 9 duels were phenomenal. I bet it'll move back up once I get on it next time, which also could be in 2024, maybe, who knows, especially if I'm dueling the other train. Even though it's been a while since I rode Twisted Colossus, I still think it deserves a spot in my top 25, and this is why it takes number 23. Coming in at number 22 is Cheetah Hunt at Busch Gardens, Tampa. Up until this year, I had Cheetah Hunt as my highest ranked coaster in the park. Then I got on Iron Gwazi, which you'll see later on this list. I think Cheetah Hunt is still the second best coaster at Busch Gardens, Tampa. I also still have it as my favorite coaster in the park, if that makes sense. I know it may be controversial to have this ride ranked over Montu, Kumba, or Shikra, but I had way more fun on Cheetah Hunt. It was so much fun running through the savannah like a cheetah. Plus, it has some excellent launches, with the second one being my favorite. Sure, the rest of the ride isn't that intense, but I don't think it was meant to be. If you want intense, go ride Tigress. That is a more intense launch coaster than Cheetah Hunt. The main reason why I still have Cheetah Hunt in my top 25 is the incredible night ride this coaster delivers. I've done some world-class night rides out there, such as the Boss, the Beast, and Outlaw Run. I actually prefer Cheetah Hunt's night ride over each of them. In fact, I have its night ride ranked second only to the Voyage. I know I'm probably overrating the night ride, but if you've ridden it at night, you understand why I like it so much. Most of the layout is extremely dark, which makes the ride feel way faster. I also got a fireworks ride on Cheetah Hunt in my most recent trip to Busch Gardens, Tampa, and it was insane seeing the layout light up in front of me briefly every now and then. That was one of the best rides I've ever had on any coaster. No matter when I ride Cheetah Hunt, I'm bound to have a good time, and that's why it lands at my number 22 spot. If pure fun is what you're looking for on a roller coaster, it doesn't get much more fun than Cheetah Hunt. Up until this point, I hope I hadn't triggered anybody too bad. I feel like that might change with this next coaster. You might really agree with me on this one, or you'll probably disagree, but I have Steel Vengeance ranked at number 21. Before you guys go rant about this, allow me to explain myself. I just did not get very good rides on it, and therefore I cannot rank it super high. I talked about my experience with this coaster on the most overrated coaster video I did back in July, and I'll post a link to that in the description of this video. I won't go too much in depth here, but here's the general rundown of what happened. This ride didn't have the insane airtime airtime I was expecting on a lot of the elements, especially in the second half. The mid-course was trimming extremely hard each time I rode Steel Vengeance, and this killed the second half, and ultimately ruined the ride's ranking for me. I always hear that the mid-course rarely trims, so getting trimmed extremely hard each time really took away from the ride. The finale was still decent since it had regained a lot of its speed by then, but other than that, the second half was mediocre at best. How about the first half? I much preferred it to the second half since most of the elements delivered. The first drop in the back row and the first 0G roll in the front row were world class, and they were easily the best parts of the ride. I also thought that the top hat, the stall under the lift hill, the double down after that stall, and the two double ups both before the first 0G roll and before the mid-course were good to great. You might have noticed that I have not mentioned the giant outer bank yet. This is the one element in the first half that was a dud. No matter where I sat, this element lacked the airtime everyone says it has. I was expecting sustained ejector airtime, but I got barely any airtime. I want to like Steel Vengeance more, but based on my 5 rides in July of 2021, I can only rank it so high. The elements in the first half, minus the giant outer bank, help put Steel Vengeance as high as it is. Maybe if I got some rides without the mid-course slowing the train down, I'd like it more, but because it almost felt like half a ride from my experience, I can't put it in my top 20. That being said, even if I did get some better rides, I still don't see it moving up too much in my rankings because of my preferences for speed over airtime. Speaking of speed, number 20 is Millennium Force, also at Cedar Point. Back when Millennium Force opened up in 2000, it was widely considered to be the best coaster of all time. While it may not have that same reputation anymore, I still think it's more than worthy of a top 20 spot. Millennium Force has an unbelievable sense of speed that is easily among the best of any coaster, and it might actually be the best. Its top speed is 93 miles an hour, but it feels a whole lot faster than that. During my high school graduation trip in July of 2021, I rode Orion in Kings Island a few days before I rode Millennium Force. While Orion felt like it was flying, I was astonished by just how much faster Millie felt by comparison. This thing never lets up until the final brakes. The layout often gets criticized for not having much airtime and being too repetitive with the overbank turns, and I personally think it does not deserve any of that hate. Besides, there are multiple other coasters at Cedar Point that were made for airtime. Steel Vengeance, Magnum, I'm looking at you. Millennium Force, in my opinion, was not built for airtime, but for speed. Since speed is my favorite part of a coaster, and Millennium Force does it better than probably every other coaster I've ridden, this makes it my type of ride. I only got 2 rides on it last time I went to Cedar Point, but I do wish I rode it a few more times. The reason why I only rode it twice? Well, you'll just have to wait until later on in this video. The rides I did get were outstanding, and that's why Millennium Force cracks my top 20. With all the launch coasters that'll make this list, it makes sense to include the coaster with the most powerful launch in America. I'm talking about Maxx Force at Six Flags Great America, coming in at number 19. When I visited Six Flags Great America in June of 2019, Maxx Force wasn't open yet. I did see it testing during that trip, and watching that train tear through that Heartline roll left me awestruck. It then opened on the 4th of July, meaning I missed it by a few weeks. I was there from June 18th through June 20th. As you can expect, I really wanted to ride Maxx Force, but I had no plans to do so. Then I realized I could add Six Flags Great America to my graduation trip, which I mentioned with Kings Island and Cedar Point already. Since Six Flags Great America is a reasonable distance away from both of those, I made that the last park of the trip with the sole purpose of doing Maxx Force. I had high hopes for this ride, and I was not disappointed. I knew it was a short ride going in, but that didn't bother me since it packs a huge punch. Let's start with that launch. Going from 0 to 78 miles per hour in 1.8 seconds is absolutely insane, and will leave you speechless every time. It's my second favorite launch I've experienced, only to top still Dragsters. Speaking of it, I always hear people say they got nervous sitting on the launch track for Dragster.
No! Oh shit!
That was me on a few of my rides, but I actually got even more nervous sitting on the launch track for Maxx Force, just because of how fast that acceleration is. I thought the dog tongue after the launch was weird, but it works. And the same could be said for the Maxx Dive Loop. And then you have that Heartline roll, which is the world's fastest inversion. I thought this element was absolutely incredible. The speed the train traversed this thing was absolutely crazy. I even said it was my favorite inversion for a while. Both the launch and the Heartline roll are 2 of my all-time favorite elements I've ever experienced. And these not only make Maxx Force a top 20 coaster for me, but also by far the best ride at Six Flags Great America. It may be short, but it's sweet for sure. Number 18 is Twisted Timbers at King's Dominion. I mentioned how Steel Vengeance's airtime strength wasn't as good as I thought it would be. Twisted Timbers probably has the strongest airtime out of any coaster in my top 25. I was able to get 2 rides on this during my one day at King's Dominion, and I felt extremely lucky to get that second ride since the crowds were extremely large. My first ride was up front in the middle of the afternoon. I thought it was really good, but I still preferred Steel Vengeance. Then I got my second ride in the back row of the green train, which that is where you want to ride for this coaster. I did that row right before closing, and wow. That left me speechless by how insane the airtime was. I sadly got stapled by the Alps, but that didn't prevent me from getting airtime. Each hill on the triple camelback had sustained ejector from my experience. The trick track double up was significantly more aggressive than up front, and the whole time I was laughing my head off. I know that some would call Twisted Timbers the best coaster King's Dominion. While I personally wouldn't go that far, I can easily understand where they're coming from. The reason why Twisted Timbers ranked higher than Steel Vengeance for me is because there were no dead spots. I thought that each element was firing on all cylinders thanks to there not being a harsh mid-course. Part of me wants to put Twisted Timbers higher than number 18, but I just can't do it for right now based on my personal preferences. Number 17 is Time Traveler at Silver Dollar City. This is by far the most unique coaster to make this list. Time Traveler is the only Mach Rides extreme spinning coaster in the US as of when I'm recording this, and is easily my favorite coaster by Mach Rides. When I first rode Time Traveler in 2020, it blew me away with how great it was. The drop out of the station was phenomenal, especially in the back car. Getting yeeted sideways out of the station is such a great experience. I also thought that both launches had a decent kick to them, and each of the inversions were great too. I thought it was excellent in 2021 as well, but I sadly did not get to experience this awesome ride in 2022. Thanks to Mother Nature wreaking havoc when I was at Silver Dollar City a few weeks ago, Time Traveler was closed all day since it was too cold for it to open. The rides I had in 2020 and 2021 were a lot of fun, and this helps put it at number 17 on my list. We've talked about a couple ejector airtime machines and a couple speed machines on this list so far, but we haven't mentioned a floater airtime machine yet. Possibly the best one that I know of is number 16, and that is Mako at SeaWorld Orlando. Formerly my top coaster in Florida, Mako is the holy grail in terms of US B&M hypercoasters that I've ridden. I know that a lot of people would consider Diamondback at Kings Island, or more recently, Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia as the best B&M hyper. And while I understand why people think either of them are the best, I still think Mako reigns supreme. If you want floater airtime, then you're on cloud 9 when you ride Mako, as there is tons of it all over the place. Every hill, well, almost every hill, will send you flying out of your seat. The 5-second floater hill was a really solid element, although I found the duration of the airtime to be a bit overrated. Plus, if you're looking for a smooth coaster, Mako is about as smooth as it can get. I think you can make a strong argument for it being the smoothest coaster in the US or maybe even the world. I rode Mako in 2021, which was 5 years after it first opened, and I did not even notice the slightest rattle anywhere. This is a coaster that you can marathon all day without worrying about getting a headache, and I hope it stays that way for many, many years to come. While the ride experience itself is phenomenal, I have to mention the soundtrack. Excluding on-ride soundtracks, Mako probably has the best soundtrack of any coaster. You can hear it in the queue line, the station, and even some speakers on the lift hill play some intense music to get you hyped up for your ride. I like how Mako has 3 different soundtracks you can hear while in the lift hill, and this adds a bunch of free ride value for me. Much like another coaster we'll get to later on that's even in the same city as Mako, I rode Mako a ton primarily to hear the soundtrack, and the ride forces were incredible. Mako easily makes this list because the overall experience was exceptional. But it's just not quite good enough to be a top 15 coaster for now. I already talked about a couple launch coasters that I had ridden, but what about the first one? Is this where I finally mentioned Mr. Freeze at Six Flags St. Louis? No, that was not my first launch coaster. It was actually Thunderbird at Holiday World. Thunderbird takes the number 15 spot on this list. I rode Thunderbird when it first opened back in 2015, and I've done it every single year since then. This was also my first ever B&M wing coaster, and as you can expect, it's by far the best one I've done. I've also done the other 3 in the US, but none of them come anywhere close to Thunderbird. Every single time I ride Thunderbird, I have a huge smile on my face from the launch all the way to the final brake run. I don't think that there is a dull moment on Thunderbird either. The launch out of the barn is still one of the best launches I've experienced, despite being the first one. It catches me off guard every single time. Each of the inversions are all excellent. The Immelman and vertical loop are gray out inducing. The inline twist at the end is a fantastic near miss element and delivers some awesome hang time. And the 0G roll is always great and adds to the layout. The overbank turns between the vertical loop and 0G roll pull some good positives, and the twisted hill before the inline twist delivers some floater airtime. The last time I rode Thunderbird was during Hollywood Nights of this year, and it was the most intense I've ever seen that thing run. My legs were going numb on each of the valleys, and it honestly felt similar to some of the old school B&M inverts I've ridden. I never get tired of Thunderbird, and whenever I go to Holiday World, sometimes I'm more excited to ride Thunderbird than I am Voyage. I know that may seem crazy, but that's just the truth. I also know that a lot of people rank Thunderbird as 3rd or 4th best at Holiday World, but I definitely prefer Thunderbird to both Raven and Legend, especially after how insane Thunderbird was this year. No matter how many coasters I ride, Thunderbird will always be ranked near the top of my list, and this video is no exception. Taking the number 14 spot is probably the most important coaster on this list. Everyone has that coaster that got them into being a coaster enthusiast, and for me, that coaster was Screamin' Eagle at Six Flags St. Louis. This coaster may seem really high, but I can't not put it high because of the sentimental value. It's the same reason why I like Space Mountain so much. I would not be on YouTube making this video right now if I never ridden Screamin' Eagle. That's not to be confused with my first ever coaster, as I did ride American Thunder, Pandemonium, and River King Mine Train before I rode Screamin' Eagle. I still give Screamin' Eagle credit for being the one that got me over my fear, since I was way more nervous from it than the other three I just mentioned. I broke my fear of this ride in November of 2014 when I got on it for the first time, and I loved every second of it. Screamin' Eagle instantly became my favorite operating ride in the park. And I say operating because my actual favorite ride in the park, and it still is to this day, was the recently closed Scooby-Doo Ghost Blasters. This was a dark ride that closed a month and a half prior to my first ride on Eagle, and is where Justice League Battle for Metropolis currently stands. Another reason why I have Screamin' Eagle ranked so high is that it has a great sense of speed. RCDB says it goes 62 miles an hour, but the wooded setting makes it feel way faster. This makes it harder to get some shots of the ride, but in return provides one of the best night rides you'll find anywhere. You cannot see a single thing when you're out in the woods, because you go down the first drop, go over the first hill, and then when you go over the second hill, as soon as you drop in the trees, you're in total darkness. This makes the ride feel way more out of control. The only time you can actually see something at night is if you get a ride where the moon lights up the track in the woods. Back in October this year, the moon was in the perfect spot one night. As soon as the train crested the lift hill, the moon was right in front of me, which was a breathtaking sight, but at the same time, kinda creepy. Once the ride dropped into the trees, the track was illuminated by the moonlight. First ride I got like that, I deemed as my favorite ride on any coaster at night. I came back for 4 more rides just to fly through the trees with the moonlight in the track. Screamin' Eagle also has multiple solid airtime moments throughout the layout, and these are especially good in the back of the train. The drop off the first turn, along with the drop off the turn on next to the boss's lift hill, are absolutely ridiculous when the ride is hauling. I always really enjoy this coaster every time I ride it, and I'll forever have a soft spot for Screamin' Eagle. This is why it makes number 14 on this list. Number 13 is my favorite premier rides coaster that I had ridden, Poltergeist at Six Flags Fiesta, Texas. I'm just kidding. Of course it's Mr. Freeze at Six Flags St. Louis. Now that the one in Texas is going forwards again, the one at St. Louis, as of right now, is the only one that goes backwards. If there's one thing I really like about Mr. Freeze at Six Flags St. Louis, it's how consistent it is. It always leaves me out of breath by the end of the ride thanks to the forces it pulls. I also have ridden this one in the back row, whereas in Texas I didn't. That's another reason why the St. Louis version ranks higher. I was still strictly a front row rider for every coaster, and I didn't start branching out to try other rows till 2020. I personally don't prefer the front row or the back row on Mr. Freeze, as both are equally great. The back is better for the trip out, especially for the inverted top hat and vertical spike, but I think the front has the upper hand for the return trip, especially the Oberbank. You really feel the speed here as well. I originally had this ride a bit lower in my top 25, but the reason why it cracked my top 15 and close to my top 10 were the triple night rides that my friend Ryan and I got on October 8th. I have a link to the vlog from that day in the description of this video, so you guys can go check it out if you haven't seen it. But basically, here's what happened. Ryan and I were on one of the trains on Mr. Freeze, and it was at the end of the night. The train that we were on had fewer people in line for it, and the opposite train had more people in line. Because they were alternating trains still, we got to go 3 times in a row without leaving our seat, and we even got the last train of the night as a result of it. This made the experience all the more exciting, and the fact that the ride operators clearly did not have to do this made it even more special to us. I would even call it the best end I've ever had at any amusement park day. On top of the ops going out of their way to help our nights end with a bang, the rides we got on Mr. Freeze were the wildest we've ever had on it. Mr. Freeze was ridiculous earlier in the day, and Ryan and I didn't think it would be topped. Then we got those ridiculous night rides, and look where it ranks now. I have Six Flags St. Louis as Mr. Freeze's high mainly because of how consistent the ride is, but the triple night rides we got pushed it even higher and almost into my top 10. But it'll have to settle for number 13. Number 12 is Outlaw Run at Silver Dollar City. My favorite coaster at Silver Dollar City is an absolute powerhouse. Outlaw Run is considered by many as one of the best wooden coasters out there, and it's not hard to see why. While it may be short, everything this coaster does is what makes it so great. Let's start with the setting. Outlaw Run is hidden within the woods, which makes photographing or filming it a nightmare, but it also makes the sense of speed feel even faster than 68 miles an hour. On top of that, night rides on Outlaw Run are out of this world. It's completely dark once you crest the lift hill, and you can't see where you're going. This makes the elements more unpredictable. I got multiple night rides in 2021 when the moon was positioned in a way so that when the train went through the first inversion, the riders were staring directly into it, which was amazing. In case you haven't noticed by now, this is pretty much the same as the recent night rides I mentioned when I talked about Screamin' Eagle. I think both coasters are similar in multiple different ways, but I give Outlaw Run the edge for having a better night ride overall, along with better elements. Speaking of the elements, there are some great ones. The first drop is great, and it gives some awesome airtime in the back of the train. The wave turn is really solid too, and can deliver some great airtime as well, depending on how badly it gets stapled. Let's face it, it's really difficult to avoid getting stapled on this ride. I also really like the double barrel roll at the end. In 2021, I pulled a Star Fox and shouted, "Do a barrel roll!" while I went through it. That's not to ignore the other ejector hills, the first inversion and the overbank under the lift hill. Outlaw Run never lets up until the final brakes, and it's one of the only coasters that I know of that can run too fast, if not the only one. In 2020, the tracks were wet since it was raining, and Outlaw Run was hauling as you expect. Well, it actually hauled too much, as it overshot the final brakes 3 different times throughout the day. This caused the ride to go down for a while the first 2 times it happened, and on the 3rd time it closed for the night right after. The only 2 rides I got on Outlaw Run in 2020 were phenomenal, but I got many more in 2021. This trip made me realize that the more I ride it, the more I enjoy it. Much like Time Traveler, Outlaw Run was closed during my trip to Silver Dollar City since it was too cold, but I really enjoyed every ride I've gotten on it. My only complaint with this coaster is that it's too short, but that doesn't mean I like it any less. So I feel like number 12 is a great spot for it for now. Number 11 is a fan favorite for coaster enthusiasts, and this is Maverick at Cedar Point. This is one of the most well-rounded coasters out there, and it has basically everything you could want in a good layout. You want airtime, inversions, rapid transitions, world-class launch, a great drop? Maverick has it all. I already mentioned how Mr. Freeze was a great example of a coaster that is very consistent, and Maverick also fits the bill. Each of the elements all pack a huge punch, especially the second launch inside the tunnel. When I first rode it in 2016, it was insanely forceful and was my favorite launch on any coaster. I forgot what it felt like until I rode it again in 2021. I was stunned by how great it was, even more so than in 2016. The launch has since been outclassed by a few other launches I experienced after this, including Maxx Force, which I already discussed. The rest of the ride throws you around like a ragdoll. The first drop took me by surprise. The small camelback at the end and the larger camelback near the beginning both deliver the ejector airtime Intimate is known for. The Stingle dive at the end will try and throw you out of the train as well. The Twisted Horseshoe roll may be the weakest part of the ride, but it still makes Maverick feel even more complete. Maverick may have been outclassed by another similar in-span coaster that's much higher up on this list, but that doesn't mean it's a bad ride. Not even close. This thing is still my second favorite coaster at Cedar Point, and it's a phenomenal ride. I bet when you clicked on this video, you expected Maverick to be somewhere on this list, and here it is, almost cracking my top 10. At last, we have made it into my top 10. Let's start off with Intimidator 305 at King's Dominion. This may seem a bit low to a lot of other people, as I know tons of other enthusiasts have Intimidator 305 in their top 5, if not higher. The thing is, I simply didn't get to ride it enough as I would have liked to. Like I recently stated with Outlaw Run, the more I ride a coaster, the more I like it, and I was only able to get 2 rides on I-305. I already mentioned that King's Dominion was packed the day I visited, and this made rewriting something without skipping a few credits impossible to achieve. Since this also was my 200th coaster, I feel like I could not settle for just one ride. I had to get a second one. I decided to skip Anaconda and Racer 75 so I could rewrite I-305. It's a good thing I did that, since my first ride, despite being great, wasn't quite as intense as I expected it to be. The second ride, on the other hand, was every bit as intense as I expected it to be. I bet that if I got some more rides on I-305, I'd have it ranked a lot higher than number 10. With that long explanation out of the way as to why it's not ranked higher, let's talk about why Intimidator 305 is in my top 10. Obviously, the sense of speed is phenomenal. While I don't think it's quite as good as Millennium Force's, it's up there for sure. When I realized I'd be hitting my 200th coaster during my 2021 Virginia trip, I really wanted it to be Intimidator 305 since that thing is a speed machine like I just said. I also love how intense this ride is, especially that blackout turn at the very start of the ride. This coaster is considered the most intense out there. I personally disagree, but I understand why a lot of other people do think that. The positives on this ride were absolutely insane, and the rapid transitions that this ride had were like Mavericks on steroids. I found that Intimidator 305 was a bit shorter of a ride, but I personally didn't mind that one bit. If anything, I felt like it would have been too much to handle if it was any longer. Shorter length aside, this coaster is easily a top 10 coaster for sure. Number 9 is a coaster that I did not expect to make my top 10, and this is Mamba at Worlds of Fun. I'm pretty sure that you're surprised to see this Morgan Hypercoaster this high on the list, but if you've ridden it without the mid-course turned on, you understand where I'm coming from. Or at least, hopefully you do. I rode Mamba for the first time this year, and the mid-course brake run had recently been disabled. Ever since that happened, I started hearing really good things about Mamba, especially with how insane the return trip was. Seeing as critically acclaimed airtime moments don't usually live up to the hype for me, I wonder what I would think of Mamba's finale. Let me just say, the hype was real with this one. Every single hill on the finale launched me out of my seat with incredible force, and right when I landed in my seat, I got launched again. I was laughing the entire time because of how insane it was. If you want me to be perfectly honest, I actually prefer Mamba's finale over Magnum's finale. I know that's unpopular for a lot of you, but for me, Magnum's finale was too painful for me to enjoy. At least up front it was. I did find Mamba's finale in the back row to be somewhat painful, but nowhere near as bad as the pain I got on Magnum's finale when riding in the front row. Now that you know my opinion on the finale, what about the rest of the ride? I thought it was great. The speed in the first half was way better than I expected it to be, and the helix at the far end of the ride was also extremely intense. The positives were so strong that I started graying out there, and I wasn't expecting it. This ride originally was not in my top 10 until I got a phenomenal night ride during Haunt this past October. My first few rides earlier in the day were not as good as I remembered it being back in July, but the ride I got at night was out of this world. The sense of speed was amplified, and the airtime was so powerful. Interestingly enough, I actually prefer Mamba's night ride to Prowler's night ride, although both are really good at night for sure. The forces and the speed alone make Mamba my favorite coaster at Worlds of Fun, and the night ride elevates it to my number 9 spot. This next placement will turn some heads. As number 8, I have the Boss at Six Flags St. Louis. I'm not going to go too much in depth in this video since I already made a separate review for this coaster. You can find the link to that video in the description of this one. I'll just state the key points for the sake of this video. A lot of people seem to love this ride, and others seem to hate it. The Boss is extremely fast and intense with some really good airtime thrown in. It may not be the smoothest ride out there, but that normally doesn't bother me. And then the night rides on this thing are incredible. One thing I did not mention in my review is that I cannot decide between this or Screamin' Eagle for the best night ride at Six Flags St. Louis. Boss has an overall faster top speed, and it has better airtime, but the mid-course kills the speed in the second half, and I think it's not quite as dark as Screamin' Eagle. I still think you can make a strong argument for both of them being the better night ride, but in terms of the better ride overall, I give the Boss the edge. I cannot put it any higher than number 8 for right now since it's honestly not quite as special to me anymore since it's at my home park and I ride it all the time. Taking the number 7 spot is Orion at Kings Island. Yes, I do like this coaster more than Intimidator 305 for right now. I have no idea why, but every time I visit Kings Island, after the trip is over, I always seem to forget how Orion rides until my next trip to Kings Island when I get back on it. When I last rode it in August of 2022, I wonder if I would walk off disappointed since I had ridden the other US Giga coasters since my last time on Orion. To my surprise, I was not disappointed, and I was actually more impressed than before. The speed I remember the ride having was still there, and some of the elements were a lot better than last time. The twisted hill before the final brakes launched me out of my seat every single time. The helix makes me gray out, especially if the ride's flying, and that speed hill before the trimmed camelback is probably my favorite moment of floater airtime, even over Mako's 5-second floater hill. I also think that Orion might have the best night ride at Kings Island. I did not get on it at night on my last trip since I attempted to get a lights on ride on Flight of Fear, but that failed. Plus, I was getting some night rides that I'd never experienced before, such as Banshee, Diamondback, and Mystic Timbers. And then I did get a night ride on the Beast as well, since it's not a trip to Kings Island without doing that at least once. Next time I go to Kings Island, I'll make sure to try Orion at night again. During the day, it's still great, and it's still my favorite coaster at Kings Island, and my number 2 coaster in Ohio. And like I said before, it's my number 7 overall coaster. Number 6 is Iron Gwazi at Busch Gardens, Tampa. This right here is the gold standard of RMCs, at least in the US, and is also what I wish Steel Vengeance was. While it isn't as long as Steel Vengeance, I thought all of the elements on Iron Gwazi packed a greater punch, and there are also no dead spots. Let's start with that first drop. This thing is absolutely phenomenal. While Steel Vengeance also has a phenomenal first drop, the extra degree that Iron Gwazi has on its first drop does in fact make a difference. In fact, this is my favorite first drop I've ever experienced, even ahead of Time Traveler's drop out of the station. It's also got a killer inversion with the death roll, and it threw me out of my seat in the back row. The wave turn was great as well, but this is the one element on the ride that was slightly overrated. I got 4 rides on Iron Gwazi with 2 in the front row and 2 in the back row. This element did not hit as hard as I expected it to until my last ride at night. I thought that the other elements were really solid as well. That being said, I was expecting more after my first ride. Based on what I heard from other enthusiasts before I rode Iron Gwazi, I was expecting it to be flying full speed really early in the morning, but that wasn't quite the case. Iron Gwazi was running way slower than I expected on my first ride, but it somehow was running much faster on my next ride about 15 to 20 minutes later. If you have not ridden Iron Gwazi yet, I personally would not recommend expecting it to be running at full speed first thing in the morning. I'm not judging it based on that first ride I got, as the other rides were unbelievable. This coaster may be the best ride at Busch Gardens, Tampa, but is it my favorite coaster in Florida? There are 2 other coasters in Florida that I have ranked above it, and you can probably figure out at least one of them. That other coaster, though, cracking the top 5 is the most intense coaster on this list, and that is the Incredible Hulk coaster at Islands of Adventure. When you first clicked on this video, I'm pretty sure you might have not seen this one coming, but if you watched my channel for a while, then you might have. I have no way to tell. Anyway, before I go any further, I need to mention the most obvious reason why I have Hulk in my top 5, the on-ride soundtrack. This may seem like a dumb reason to rank this coaster higher than Iron Gwazi, and I actually had Iron Gwazi in my top 5 originally, not Hulk. After giving it some more thought, I realized that I had so much more fun on Hulk because the on-ride soundtrack was absolutely incredible, no pun intended. It was so great that I rode Hulk 39 times over the 5 days I was at Universal back in June, just because I wanted to hear the soundtrack a bunch. If you have not heard the on-ride soundtrack for this coaster, check it out. The soundtrack also emphasizes the Hulk's insane sense of speed. Thanks to the launch lift hill at the start, Hulk absolutely flies through the course at breakneck speeds, and the soundtrack makes it feel even faster. Both the speed and the soundtrack emphasizes Hulk's intensity. This coaster is one of the few coasters that I consider to be way more intense than I-305. Well, not way more intense, but more intense in general. The Incredible Hulk coaster pulls so many strong positive G's at several different parts of the layout. This thing is not just a coaster, it's an endurance test. As you can expect, 39 times over the 5 days I was there was a lot to take. There were multiple rides where my arms were sore from the intensity, and I felt that for a week after my trip to Universal. This coaster is definitely not for everyone. If extreme intensity is too much for you, I think you'd enjoy something more along the lines of like Hagrid in the same park. Now let's discuss how good the elements are. I think that Hulk is the best collection of inversions on any coaster, and there is not a bad inversion on this ride in my opinion. Its Zero G Roll, Cobra Roll, and First Corkscrew are my favorites of those types of inversions. Let's discuss why each one is great, starting with the Zero G Roll. Along with being extremely whippy, this thing is my favorite because of the airtime I got going through it. The front row left outside seat was my favorite seat on this coaster because the Zero G Roll launched me out of my seat from the moment I entered the inversion to the valley before the Cobra Roll. This meant that I got sustained upside down airtime. I was astonished how a coaster could deliver that, but Hulk's Zero G Roll managed to pull off exactly that. It just might be my favorite airtime moment as well. I thought that Hulk's Cobra Roll was the best because it's both extremely intense and very smooth. A smooth Cobra Roll is something that some of the other B&Ms I've ridden don't do very well, especially a certain coaster an hour away that is very similar to Hulk, but we don't talk about that coaster. Many of you may take Alpengeist Cobra Roll over Hulk's, and that one was personally really rough for me on one of my rides, whereas on Hulk it was glossy smooth every single ride. As for my favorite corkscrew, I already mentioned it was the first one. The speed that the Hulk rips through this first corkscrew is absolutely ridiculous. Oddly enough, this corkscrew often felt more intense in the morning than any other time of day. In fact, it can rip through the first half so fast, it can actually stop on the mid-course for a few seconds, and this happened to me on a few of my rides. Those three inversions I already mentioned, the world-class launch, and the spectacular onboard audio, along with the rest of the layout, easily make Hulk a top 5 coaster for me. This is also one of, if not the only coaster that I've ridden where I was genuinely sad when I hit the final brakes on my last ride. If that doesn't show you how much I like this ride, I don't know what does. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that Orion was my number 2 coaster in Ohio. My number 1 coaster in Ohio takes a number 4 spot. That number 4 coaster is Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point. This crazy intimate accelerator was by far my favorite coaster at Cedar Point, and it was also the reason why I only rode Millennium Force twice on my last trip. While it may not be in operation at the moment, it had everything I value most in a coaster. Obviously, it's got the ridiculous hydraulic launch, or it used to have that. Out of all the launches I've experienced, this was the best of them all, and it wasn't close. Not only that, but it was also the best coaster element I've ever experienced. I personally don't know if that'll be beat anytime soon, but a certain other Intamin strata coaster in New Jersey may have something to say about that. Seeing as Dragster launched riders at 120 miles an hour, this makes it the fastest coaster I've ridden. Seeing as launches are my favorite coaster elements, and speed is my favorite sensation of a coaster, and this launch combined both, I couldn't not give this launch the title of my favorite coaster element. Top Thrill Dragster may have been a very short experience, but it was also super intense. The very definition of short but sweet. I want to put Top Thrill Dragster in my top 3, but I just can't do it for right now since the coasters ahead of it are more complete packages. But this was easily the best one-trick pony I think ever created. Kicking off the top 3 is Fury 325 at Carowinds. This is considered by many as B&M's best coaster, and that's definitely the case for me. At the end of my Southeast trip back in June, I originally thought that Fury was the best coaster that I rode on the trip and my number 2 overall, but I have decided to move it to number 3. Fury 325 had by far the best sense of speed out of any coaster on that trip. I mentioned this in my Carowinds vlog, but the main reason why I put Fury 325 ahead of Top Thrill Dragster is because I felt that the sense of speed was just as good, but it lasted for a much longer period of time. Fury 325 may be lacking the launch that Dragster had, but it doesn't need one. Plus, we already had 2 launched B&Ms on this list. It also has some good airtime moments with the treble clef, the last few bunny hills, and the first drop in the back row is also good. Fury 325 was the last Giga coaster in the US that I needed to ride, and it turns out I saved the best for last. Fury set the bar really high. I don't see any other B&M coaster breaking it into my top 3, but there are still 2 coasters that I have ranked higher. Since I thought Fury 325 was originally the best coaster I rode on my Southeast trip, and I moved one above it, what is that other coaster? Comment coming in as no surprise to anyone, this number 2 coaster is none other than Velocicoaster at Islands of Adventure. I kind of teased this earlier, but Velocicoaster is my top coaster in Florida. I originally had Velocicoaster ranked behind Fury 325 and even top Little Dragster at the end of my trip, but after giving it some more thought, I realized just how amazing Velocicoaster really is, so I felt like it deserved to be ranked ahead of them. Maverick was a complete package, but this thing is Maverick on steroids. Velocicoaster did Maverick better than Maverick did. Well, except for the steepness of the drop. Besides that, Velocicoaster does everything better, especially in terms of the veteran version. Of course, I'm referring to the critically acclaimed Mosasaurus roll. This barrel roll over the water is easily the best inversion I've experienced. The way the train flies through this thing is unlike any other inversion I've ever experienced, and it is insane. I find it hilarious that the Incredible Hulk coaster has the best collection of inversions I've experienced, but none of them are as good as the Mosasaurus roll. I also love both launches on Velocicoaster. The first launch was way more intense than I expected, and then the second launch pressed me against the back of my seat with incredible force. I also love that creepy ghost-like dinosaur roar that can be heard near the coaster's first half once the train starts to climb up the top hat. Speaking of the top hat, I loved the view that I got from the top of it, even though I didn't have long to take it in. I also got some pretty good airtime when the train crested the top. That's not even to mention all the other elements on the ride. The stall is good, the speed hill before the Mosasaurus roll gave a brief moment of airtime, and the bunny hill in the first half gave some even stronger airtime. Of course, Velocicoaster would only be a shell of its possible self without the theming, and the theming with this ride is some of the best I've seen on any coaster. The queue line is very well done from start to finish, and there's also some theming during the ride's first half. The first half takes place inside of a raptor paddock, and so you're flying in and out of rockwork while dodging the raptors. There is one, I guess you could say, issue I have with this ride, but I honestly wouldn't even call it an issue, but more of a nitpick. I'm talking about the restraints. My main issue with these lap bars is not in the comfort department, but rather the fact that they come down very easily. I found it very difficult to avoid getting stabled on Velocicoaster even when holding them up. I'm normally a hands-up rider, but on one of my 11 rides, I had to hold on to the lap bar because there was apparently a promo shoot that was happening at the time, and even when holding up the lap bar, I ended up stapled. I thought that the airtime was slightly hindered because of it. Like I said, this is a nitpick, but if there was a way to make the restraints not come down as easily, that would be great. After all, there are much worse restraints out there that could have been installed on this ride. The ride experience on Velocicoaster is pretty much as good as it can get for a steel coaster, and it deserves a spot in my top 2. That being said, it's a distant number 2 coaster, and would likely be my number 1 coaster if it wasn't for a certain wooden coaster a few hours away from me. In case you have not figured it out by now, my number 1 coaster is the Voyage at Holiday World. This should not be surprising to anyone. I had Thunderbird on this list, and then Legend was an honorable mention. This epic gravity group coaster is, in my opinion, the perfect example of a wooden coaster. I know lots of people would say El Toro is better, but I have not ridden that one yet, and I do not see it beating the Voyage. There are so many things that the Voyage does well. Let's start with the setting. Most of the layout takes place in the woods, and it even passes under Thunderbird at a couple different points. This can lead to some awesome interactions between the two rides if the dispatches are synced up. Along with causing some cool interactions, it allows for the sense of speed to be even greater than it actually is. When I think of wooden coasters with the best senses of speed, the Voyage is easily among the best. This is only the beginning of what makes this coaster so elite. It also has tons of amazing airtime. While Steel Vengeance is advertised to have the most airtime of any coaster, I personally still think that the Voyage has it beat. This sucker has floater airtime and even some ejector airtime scattered throughout the layout. On top of that, you're in for one of the most intense experiences on any coaster anywhere. Voyage tries to kill you from start to finish, especially on the Spaghetti Bowl. This insane mess of track throws you all over the place, and it's demented. The mid-course brake run does slow the train down during normal operating hours, but it doesn't bother me since the sequence that follows is unrivaled by any other coaster I've ridden. You see, the Voyage's mid-course is on ground level, and since you're actually climbing up a hill for the first part of the ride, you don't even notice it. So the Voyage starts off its insane return run with a triple down. This not only helps the train regain all the speed it had in the first half, but it also makes you feel like you're defying the laws of physics with how fast you're picking up speed. The Voyage is one of those coasters that gets better as it goes on through the layout. I think this is something that very few coasters can achieve, like Velocicoaster is another example of that. The Voyage is already phenomenal during the daylight, and it's legendary at night. There's little to no debate that the Voyage has the world's greatest night ride. It's completely dark from start to finish, and this not only makes it hard to see where you're going, but also emphasizes the sense of speed, like I said before. From the moment you go down the first drop to the moment you hit the final brakes, the sense of speed makes you feel like you're Sonic the Hedgehog as you absolutely haul through the woods while rapidly changing directions at an alarming rate. You feel that during the daytime as well, but it's emphasized at night. Every time I ride the Voyage, I always get off wondering how this ride is legal, and this makes it an easy choice for my number 1 coaster. That is a wrap on my top 25 coasters I have ridden as of the end of 2022. 2022. Like I said at the beginning, I know that this top 25 list is different from a lot of other ones out there, but if anything, I feel like this list was unique. I hope I didn't trigger anybody too bad with this list, but like I said, my preferences are different, and all I ask is that you respect my opinions, even if you disagree. I know that a lot of other coasters that people consider to be elite did not make this list, and this is because I either have not ridden them yet, or I have ridden them, and I either do not remember them, or they were not quite top 25 worthy. All that being said, before you click off of this video, please be sure to leave a like, and feel free to comment what your top 25 coasters are. And if you don't have a top 25, just list some of your favorite coasters. I'm interested to see what some of your guys' favorites are, even if they're the same as a lot of other enthusiasts. If you're new to this channel and like what you saw, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. My goal is to hit 400 subscribers by the time Six Flags St. Louis' 2023 opening day comes around, so I'd appreciate you subscribing and turning the bell on so you get notified every time I upload. I also have an Instagram account for all the pictures that I take when visiting theme parks, so be sure to check that out via the link in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you later.